Jo Avery and I'm a quilt and embroidery designer based just outside Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'm here to talk to you today about my forthcoming book by Stash Books, which is called Modern Crewel Embroidery, and it comes out in October. Now, as the book's not out yet and all of the projects are still with the publisher, I don't have a lot of things from the book to show you, but I do have one embroidery which is in the book. It's called the Doodle Hoop, and I've made a new version of it. So the book is 15 fresh modern samplers, and a sampler is a way of showing off lots of different stitches. So that's what I've done here. Let's go up a bit closer so you can see. So I've chosen all my favourite stitches, and in the book I take you through all of those basic stitches, and then we bring in some bonus stitches, and as you can see here I fill in these different shapes with the stitches, and it gives this wonderful raised texture. The meaning of crewel is actually embroidery with wool, and that's what we're using throughout this book. I'm actually using Aurifil wool thread rather than crewel wool. I have used some crewel wool, but Aurifil thread is the majority of what I've used, and I've actually got a whole new box called Stitching with Wool, which has got 10 of the favourite colours that I've used throughout the book, and in fact that's why I've done this one, because it's in all of the colours from that wool collection. And actually here's another one. Now this is less of a sampler because what I've done here is it's more of a pictorial embroidery where I've chosen my favourite stitches, and this is actually based on a quilt that I've just made, and I thought it would work really well as an embroidery too, but it's in all these colours from the Stitching with Wool collection. I'm going to show you a couple of other embroideries that I've done recently with wool, so you get the idea of how you can use wool, how you can use the stitches. This is very much the aesthetic from the book, but again these aren't really samplers, they're more pictorial embroideries, very abstract flowery ones. Here's one a little bit more realistic. This is my peacock hiding in a jungle. Lots of lovely colours, all that wonderful rich wool. All of this is in the book, but the book, as I say, is really all about samplers. So what we do is we create some shapes and then we fill them with stitches. So here's one I've started on. This is actually based on the original idea for this book, which is called my Pebble Sampler. It's a lot bigger than this, inspired by the free motion quilting pattern, and really just freehand drawing lots of little pebble shapes and then filling them with different stitches and different colours. Lots of fun and something very accessible. Now what I thought I'd do today is to show you how to make one of the stitches that I've used in the book. I call it Vintage Rose, and it's a different sort of rose from the rose you'll see most of the time these days, which is a sort of whipped wheel rose. This one's a little bit different. Possibly a little bit harder to pick up from illustrations, so I thought it'd be really good to actually do a hands-on tutorial for this, get you ready for the book coming out. So let's have a look at a vintage rose. So this is a vintage rose. Here's an embroidery I'm about to start, some crewel work with my wool thread, and here's this vintage rose. I'm just going to bring it up so you can see it closer. That isn't filling a space, but just exists on its own as a round rose. So that's one way you can do it, but I'm going to show you how to do this to fill a shape today, and you can use it both ways. So I've already outlined this shape, this little circle, with just a single thread and back stitch in a sort of charcoal. I'm actually using a double thread here, so I've just doubled the thread like this and knotted one end, and that's through there, and I've basically just taken this bit of thread through here so it's fixed nicely, and then once I've started stitching I can cut that knot away. This is known as the waist knot method. So I'm going to bring my needle up through the center part of the circle I'm going to fill. What we're going to do to start with is we're just going to do a few stitches to fill the middle of this shape. And usually what I do is sort of build a little triangle in. And this rose that we're doing, it basically starts in the centre, and it's created using overlapping stitches from the centre outwards, just like a rose petals are. So all we need to do to start with is just a few stitches to give us something to work around. Now we've got that actual shape, we're going to just start working around that. We're going to come up and we're just going to work with straight stitches. The straight stitches are going to just cut off the end of this little shape that we started with, and we're going to work round clockwise, and each time we do a straight stitch and it fits snug to the shape at the centre, but it extends a little bit beyond it. Once we get going, I'll be able to explain a little bit more to you. It can seem a bit mysterious at the start, this. It's like, what is she doing? She's just making a big knot. You can't see a rose at all, but what I used to say to my students when I used to teach this was, imagine the rose and the rose will appear, and it seemed to work. So we're doing these straight stitches and they are going to overlap around that centre shape that we created, which was just created with a few stitches. It was maybe just a little triangle, but now as we go we make a multi-sided shape. So it's become possibly a hexagon now, and it might get bigger, more like an octagon. And you can actually see, I can see the rose appearing now. So that was one straight stitch, so I'm just going to pull it so you can see where it is. The next one is going to go a little bit round. Whoops, hang on, pulled it out again. It's going to come out and it's going to knock off, just cut across this next corner of the shape and end up overlapping the last straight stitch that we did. So come up, you know, we're just sort of taking little angles around. We don't want to square it too much. We want as many sides as possible on this rose because we want it to end up circular at the end. So you come up a little bit over here. We can extend it a bit. It's going to be a slightly bigger one here, but we always go back to about the middle, the outer side of the middle of the stitch that we just did. So, and we don't want to make our stitches too small and cramped, otherwise you just end up with a knot in the middle. We want to kind of extend beyond that shape each time. So I'm coming up here and I'm always going back to the middle. There's that stitch I just did, the middle of that, the outside of the middle of the stitch I just did before. And we just keep going around like this, and hopefully you can now see that rose appearing. We're just wrapping this shape with overlapping straight stitches, and they look like petals. I'm going to keep going so that you can see the rose emerging. And it's getting bigger all the time. And if we were going to just make this a standalone rose like the one I just showed you on that little rose bush that I'm starting to create, then really we can stop at any time that we think our rose is finished. And that's usually when it's looking circular enough. As we make this shape bigger and the sides, the many sides longer, the angles on them soften, and instead of being kind of hexagons or octagons, they end up just being a circle. So you can kind of see that happening now. So I could just about stop now and that would be a little rose, or I could keep going so that I soften my edges more and the whole thing looks rounder. I think you should just, if you're just doing this as a standalone one rather than filling a shape, then you should just, when the rose looks finished to you, then the rose is finished. And you could actually also just do, you might decide it's a bit unequal, that your rose is not very balanced, so you could just add some of these straight stitches to one side and not just go all the way around. Now what's going to happen with this one is that it is a little bit imbalanced. It's not going to completely fit this shape. I'm going to keep going round and in my circular fashion, but at some point I'm going to have to add some extra stitches in to fill out the areas where there's some extra background showing, because I really want this to fill up the whole space. So let's just keep going. I actually had to just secure some more thread because I'd run out, and you can see how I've finished all of this side here, but I've still got some background through there. So what I'm going to do is just skip over the bit that I've already done and just finish filling up these areas here where you can still see some background. So that's what you do when you're filling one of these shapes, rather than just stopping when you think your rose is finished. And it may end up that the rose, you don't have to fill a circular shape, you can fill more of an oblongy shape, and then you just keep going, filling up the areas with these overlapping stitches until the whole area is filled, and it's just a rose-filled pebble. There we go, and that's that finished. Well, I hope you have a go at this and enjoy doing it, and I hope when the book comes out you'll embark on a modern crewel embroidery adventure of your own.